So we're in the book of Daniel. Last week we did an overview and halfway through chapter 1. This week we're going to finish chapter 1, get into chapter 2, and who knows where we're going to end up. The two themes that are in Daniel, and we're going to talk about both of them and put them into context. The first one is how to live in a post-Christian society, and the context is very simple. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego were offered the meats of the king that were offered to idol. And you see there, verse 8, Daniel resolved, or he purposed in his heart, that he would not defile himself. So that's the first thing that's in Daniel. The second thing that's in Daniel is that God is sovereign over all affairs. And we have Daniel 2:21. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. The context of that we're going to see in chapter 2, where Daniel is going to interpret the dream of Nebuchadnezzar. And as he gets the interpretation from God, he says this beautiful prayer, a prayer of praise and a prayer of thanksgiving. And in the middle of that prayer, he gives that verse. So that's the context right in the middle of that dream of Nebuchadnezzar, which has become known as the backbone of prophecy. So Daniel covers stories of integrity, and it's the backbone of prophecy. The backbone of prophecy because in chapter 2, he gives this dream of Nebuchadnezzar and an interpretation, and then later on, he also gives the interpretation or the prophecy of how it's going to be fulfilled as he goes through the Babylonian Empire, then the Medes and the Persians, and then the Greeks, and then ultimately the Romans. So he's talking about prophecy that from our window of time is already fulfilled, but he's also talking about events yet to come. And that's what chapter 2 is all about. The purpose of eschatology, we've covered this last week, so that we would work for the Lord, so that we would live clean, and so that we would be eager to do what is good. And I borrowed a phrase from today's culture, don't worry, be happy. Don't worry, be blessed. That word blessed means happy. Blessed is the one who reads aloud the words of this prophecy, and blessed are those who hear and who keep what is written in it, for the time is near. So, Daniel chapter 1. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. State-of-the-art warfare back then. He lived in a city. The city had walls to defend, and the other army came and surrounded it and just waited. Now, that's why Hezekiah built his water tunnel so that they could have water and they'd be able to live. When Nehemiah went to rebuild the walls, there were certain sections of the walls where there were little rocks. That was because what Nebuchadnezzar was doing, he was building bonfires up against the outside of the wall, and that limestone would crack. And he started besieging it. Keep in mind, 70 years later, the walls of Babylon are going to fall, but they didn't have to build fires and they didn't have to deal with catapults to do it. And the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, into Nebuchadnezzar's hand, with some of the vessels of the house of God. And he brought them to the land of Shinar, to the house of his God, and placed the vessels in the treasury of his God. When the Philistines took the Ark of the Covenant into Dagon's temple, what happened to Dagon? He fell. When these vessels got taken into Babylon, what happened in their temple? Nothing. It was God's plan that this was going to happen. Then the king commanded Ashpenaz. Now, this is interesting. We were studying about the historical Daniel. From what I understand, in the Berlin Museum, there is a piece of the gate of Babylon, and that man's name is on that gate. So this is good history. And the king commanded Ashpenaz, his chief eunuch, to bring some of the people of Israel, both of the royal family and of the nobility, youths without blemish. Now, here we're going to have a description of Daniel, okay? Daniel was a good-looking kid. He could have been captain of the football team, captain of the wrestling team. He could have been in charge of the National Honor Society. He could have played saxophone. He could have played piano. I don't know. But I want you to look at the kids that they picked out. Youths without blemish, good appearance, skillful in all wisdom, endowed with knowledge, understanding, learning, and competent to stand in the king's palace. Let's face it, the king didn't want trolls standing around inside of his court. He wanted the best of the best. And who was selected? Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. The king assigned them a daily portion of the food that the king ate and of the wine that he drank. They were to be educated for 3 years. Imagine 14-year-olds given 3 years of the king's wine. At the end of the time, they were to stand before the king. So Daniel, he's taking a stand as a teenager. Nebuchadnezzar wanted full assimilation. He changed their language, changed their literature. They weren't reading the Bible anymore, although Daniel somehow had his hands on a copy of Jeremiah 70 years later. Changed what literature they were reading. He changed their names. He changed their diet. And Daniel, keyword, tactfully. I keep going back to that verse in Peter that talks about be prepared to give an answer for the faith that's within you and give it with gentleness and respect. How far do you think Daniel would have gone if he said, hey, Ashpenaz, I'd rather have asparagus, thank you very much. Not going to work. God honored Daniel with great wisdom and the ability to interpret dreams. Now, take this for what it's worth. Nebuchadnezzar could have also taken Daniel's manhood. This comes from Isaiah. And some of your own sons who will come from you, whom you will father, shall be taken away, and they shall be eunuchs in the palace of the king of Babylon. The best of the best. Now, why do you think they would castrate those guys? They wouldn't mess with the harem. They wouldn't have their mind on something else when they're supposed to study. They wouldn't be thinking, if I had a son, I could be the king. They would have complete loyalty. But everything that Daniel was being taken from him. See, we're living in the same age. They're taking our kids and having surgery for our kids without parents. It used to be, well, they're going to go give my daughter an abortion. They didn't tell me. Now they're going to change my daughter into a boy and not tell me. We're living in the same age. We have that theme, how to live in a post-Christian society, right front and center in the book of Daniel. So we're still on the topic of eunuchs. And we're going to come back and find out one of the purposes of Daniel's castration, if in fact he was castrated. The disciples said to Jesus, if such is the case of a man with his wife, it is better not to marry. But he said to him, not everyone can receive this saying, but only those to whom it is given. For there are eunuchs who have been so from birth. Some people are just not there. And there are eunuchs who have been made eunuchs by men. And there are eunuchs who have been made themselves eunuchs. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody goes and mutilates themselves. There's another section of the scripture, the Bible says, if your hand offends you, cut it off. Well, guess what? I can sin if I had both my hands cut off. If your eye offends you, plug it out. Well, I can envision all kinds of stuff with my eyes closed. What this is talking about is chastity. Some folks would choose not to participate. Why? We see it right there. For the sake of the kingdom of heaven. Now, Paul wrote to the Corinthians, he said, I would that you all were like I was. He was a single man. Well, if everybody listened to him, Christianity would be dead in the first 100 years. because not everybody can handle that. Food today, lions tomorrow. If Daniel didn't have his heart purpose to not eat that chicken breast, how would he face if they said, quit your prayer or you're going to the lions? A little was given and a little bit more was given. So there are some guiding principles that are here. First of all, I can't be lost. I'm firmly convinced of eternal security. I can't be lost, yet I shouldn't live for the devil. Paul wrote, what? Should we sin then that grace might abound? God forbid. I live for Christ, not because of bondage, but because of free love. In the book of Titus, we read, eager to do what is good. If it's not good for my kids, then it's not good for me. What's in a name? I said we're going to get into this in a little bit, okay? So these are the names of people from Adam down to Noah, and you see the meanings of some of those names: Adam, Seth, and Enos, mankind, appointed mortal man. And as it is appointed for man to die, and after this, the judgment. Those names, the verse from Hebrews. Now we're going to look at all the other names. And what I've done here is I've taken the Hebrew away and I've given you just the English. Mankind is appointed to a feeble, frail mortality in a fixed dwelling place. Psalm 90 says we have 70 years. And if by reason of strength you might hit 80, and after that, I'll fly away. Mary, you're on borrowed time. A fixed dwelling place. But the God who is praised comes down to teach, to instruct. As a man set forth, he was beaten, smitten, and tortured to bring us rest and a quiet peace. That's what all those names mean. There's a message in those names. Now let's take a look at the names in the book of Daniel. Among these were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah of the tribe of Judah. Now those last three got their names changed to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, and I don't know why the Babylonian names stuck as opposed to Daniel's Hebrew name stuck. Only to say that Daniel means God is my judge and had to be there again and again, because that's what the book is all about. And the chief of the eunuchs gave them names. Daniel he called Belteshazzar, Hananiah he called Shadrach, Mishael he called Meshach, and Azariah he called Abednego. Where did those boys come from? When Paul talked to Timothy in 2 Timothy, whose faith did Paul praise?
Mom and grandma.
Mom and grandma. Look at this verse. Run to and fro through the streets of Jerusalem. Look and take note. Search her squares to see if you can find one man. See if you can find a man who does justice and seeks truth, that I may pardon Jerusalem. Couldn't find the man. Jerusalem fell. So it was the mothers and the grandmothers that allowed Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel to become the men that they were. Are you done? Okay, we'll wrap up then. Youth group then is 10 minutes early. Okay. I'm going to finish on this thought, okay? Look at that second column. And this is the meaning of those names. God is my judge. That's what Daniel means. But the Lord is gracious. Who is like God? God is our help. He's my judge, but he's also my help that I don't have to be a candidate for miserable judgment. So Daniel chapter 1, we ended up last week talking about the meaning of the names, their Hebrew names. God is my judge, but the Lord is gracious. Who is like God? God is my helper. And after that, we get into, as for these four youths, God gave them learning and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Anybody know the difference between a vision and a dream?
One you're awake for.
The vision you're awake for, and the dream you're asleep. And what we're going to see is Nebuchadnezzar had a dream while he was asleep. Daniel was given the interpretation in a vision at night. So he was kept up. He couldn't go to sleep because he was troubled by this thing. At the end of the time, at the end of the 3 years, when the king had commanded that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Now, we're going to position those 3 years for Daniel as starting with age 14 and going through age 17. I don't get that from some cuneiform. I don't get that from some Rosetta Stone. I get it from Plato and Xenophon. Plato set up his own academy, and he said, 14-year-olds come to my academy. That's where they start. Xenophon was another philosopher, and he said, when you're 17, you're going to work. So 14 to 17 was that window of time. And the king spoke with them, and among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore, they stood before the king. And in every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king inquired of them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters that were in all his kingdom. Now, from what I understand, the perfect score on the SAT is a 1600. 10 times, I've read about it. Can you imagine a 16,000 on your SATs? We were just talking about Chuck Missler. I was reading today about Nikola Tesla. Now, that's not the car. The car was named after this guy, Nikola Tesla. Spoke 8 different languages, could recite entire books, not familiar with, recited. Now, take Shakespeare. I can come up with 1 or 2 lines if I think about it. He would recite entire plays. That's a Daniel. Daniel was brilliant. And Daniel was there until the first year of King Cyrus. And the question that I would ask, because when we're talking about the 2 themes, I said there was a warning for Babylon and there's a warning for the US of A. How would our 14-year-olds fare if they were thrown into a different literature, a different language, a different culture, different teachings than what we've learned here? It's an interesting question. So chapter 2 begins. First of all, I want to share with you the gospel is in Daniel chapter 2, and it's around that phrase, there is. So first of all, what is chapter 2 all about? Chapter 2 is Nebuchadnezzar demanding to his court that they explain this dream, explain what the dream was and how to interpret it, and they couldn't do it. So in that dialogue, you see these words, there is. Verse 9, if you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence to you. What is the sentence to me and you because of sin? The wages of sin is death. Verse 10, the Chaldeans answered the king and said, there's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. Romans 3:23, for all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. There's not a man who can meet the king's demands. And then verse 28, but there is a God in heaven. And without faith, it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists. There is a God in heaven. Must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. I bring this out because for whatever reason, God is bringing me in the presence of a lot of Jewish people. And I can go to the New Testament, all I want, I might as well be talking to the wall. His Old Testament gospel. Nebuchadnezzar means O Nabo, protect my son, or protect my crown. Daniel means, O Baal, protect the crown or protect the king. So we're going to see a timeline, a family tree here. So there's the family tree. And pay attention, you can see Nebuchadnezzar. Is the font too small? Font's okay? Okay. There's Nebuchadnezzar in the green. He's really the center of this thing. I want to bring out a couple of points because as soon as we get into chapter 2, we're going to see a perceived problem in the timeline. So we're going to meet Belshazzar in chapter 5. That's the guy with the handwriting on the wall. The Bible refers to him as the son of Nebuchadnezzar, but the language had no word for grandson. So he's the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. And he offered whoever could talk about the interpretation of the writing would be the third in the kingdom. The reason he could only offer the third was that his dad, Nebuchadnezzar, was really the king. He was out of town. He was number 1. Belshazzar was number 2. And he was offering, in this case, Daniel, to be number 3. But I want you to take a look at the father of Nebuchadnezzar. The father of Nebuchadnezzar was really the founder of the Babylonian dynasty. He was the one who defeated the Assyrians. He was the one who helped to defeat the Egyptians. And as we open up chapter 2, we're going to see a potential problem. In the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. Now, the reason that's a problem is Nebuchadnezzar was in charge when Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, and Daniel spent 3 years in the Babylonian University. So how could that be the second year of his reign? Well, let's take a look. Daniel 1 starts off with this phrase. In the year of the reign of Jehoiakim, this is the king over Judah, not the king over Babylon. In the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. And he takes Daniel, and the year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign is not mentioned. He happens to be the king. He happens to take Daniel, but his timeline is not mentioned. Then we jump down to verse 5, and we see they were to be educated for 3 years. And at the end of that time, they were to stand before the king. But Daniel 2, verse 1 says, in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, he had dreams. So how do we reconcile that? The answer is in how the people counted. There's 605 BC. 605 BC, Nebuchadnezzar dies. I'm sorry, Nebuchadnezzar dies, and Nebuchadnezzar becomes the king. So, in the Babylonian counting, they're not going to say in the first year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. They're going to say Nebuchadnezzar reigns. The Jewish people would say in the first year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign. Okay, it'd be sort of like if I had a grandchild and that grandchild was 6 months old, I would not say he's 1 year old, but I could say he's in his first year. So there's a little bit of a nuance there, and the nuance is going to become important as we go down just 2 more years. So then we come to 604 BC, and the Babylonians are calling that the first year, and the Jewish people are calling that the second year, and that's the second year that Daniel and friends are in the Babylonian University. Then we come down to the next year, the Babylonians are saying the second year of Nebuchadnezzar. The Jewish people are saying the third year, and it's the third year of the university. It's the year of Nebuchadnezzar's dream. And so that's how Daniel 2:1 says in the second year of his reign. At that point, the audience are the Aramaics. So in the second year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams. His spirit was troubled and his sleep left him. So because it was a dream, he was asleep. And I don't know about you, I've had some dreams where I'd wake up, go back to sleep, dream the same thing over again, wake up. Sometimes I'd wake up in sweats. Sometimes I'd wake up exhausted. But I can see how Nebuchadnezzar did this thing again and again and again, because if it was just a one or a two for, no big deal, right? Do you think kings dream the same things we dream? They don't have to worry about making the mortgage. They don't have to worry about anybody breaking into their house. They don't have to worry about the car not starting because they have 57 other ways to get somewhere. And he was the grand potentate. He dreamt other things. He was worried about what's going to happen to yours truly. Now, in our society, some people have come to the top of the pile and they didn't do so well. I think of people like Jimi Hendrix, Elvis Presley, Janis Joplin. They got to the top of the pile, they got troubled, and they solved their problem a different way. But here's Nebuchadnezzar and his dream. Then the king commanded that the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans be summoned to tell the king his dreams. So they came in and stood before the king. Now, keep in mind, he just took over in the last couple years responsibility from dad. He inherited this cabinet. And we're going to find one of two things is true. And the wording of the scripture you could conclude either way. Either he forgot the dream and he was hoping somebody was going to give him the details, or he very well knew the dream and he wanted those charlatans to really step up and not just come up with some kind of explanation, but come up with the dream itself. You look at those words and you decide which way it is. I think he knew that dream all along, because we're going to dig in here a little bit deeper, and he's going to accuse them of conspiring to make up things. So he looks at the magicians. Now, these aren't the guys that just pull rabbits out of the hat and this and that. These were real, deep, dark magicians. Just like Moses met those guys that turned those staffs into snakes. And they repeated several things until Moses turned the dust into gnats, and that was the creation of life. And so they had the deep magicians. They had people that supposedly could speak to the dead. They had the witchcraft folks, the narcotics folks, and maybe a little bit of LSD. I've read where you can lick a certain frog and get hyper on it. I don't know who decided to lick the frog for the first time. That's always what I wondered. Okay. You have astronomers and astrologers, everything under the sun, to borrow from Solomon. And we're going to see that one of those Chaldeans finally wakes up and finally admits, and he says, there's nobody under the sun that can do this. And the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. There's the question. Is he troubled to know the dream, or is he troubled to know what the dream means? Then the Chaldeans, they're the boldest ones of the bunch. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. Does it sound reasonable? Maybe the first time it did. I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled. And I think he was worried about what's going to be the next step for him. Sort of like the old song, I just lost the title. We'll just go on. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my word is firm. We're going to study the different empires, and we're going to see that the power of the grand potentate shrinks and shrinks and shrinks. And they use the word inferior. Nebuchadnezzar was the head of gold. His word was the word. There was no due process. He said, my word is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. The literal from King James, your houses will be turned into dunghills. You're going to see this is a carrot and a stick. He's going to say, here's the stick. If you don't tell me, you guys are in deep trouble. If you do tell me, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. So the Chaldeans push back one time. Nebuchadnezzar says, I don't think so. This is what I need. They answered a second time. They're given pushback the second time in front of somebody that can't spell due process. Let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will show its interpretation. And the king answered and said, I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time. We're going to see somebody else approach the king, and he gives him more time. This is going to be Daniel, because Daniel is going to approach them with sincerity. He's going to approach them with integrity, as opposed to these guys trying to weasel their thing. I know with certainty that you are trying to gain time, because you see that the word from me is firm. And if you do not make the dream known to me, there is but one sentence for you. The wages of sin is death. You have agreed to speak lying words and corrupt words before me. You have agreed among yourselves to speak lying words. And he's smelling this conspiracy out. These guys have been on the king's payroll ever since he took over, and now it's their time to really step up, and they're not going to be able to do it. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can show me its interpretation. If you can't tell me the dream, why should I trust your interpretation? A little bit different than Pharaoh and Joseph. Pharaoh just laid out the dream, and Joseph just laid out the interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the third time and said, there's not a man on earth who can meet the king's demand. All have sinned and come short of the glory of God. For no great and powerful king has asked such a thing of any magician or enchanter or Chaldean. They're not saying that's a dumb request. I mean, their houses would be dunghills prematurely. They're saying it's just a rare request. We've never done it that way before. The thing that the king asks is difficult, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. Now, there's a mouthful from somebody who didn't understand monotheism and didn't know the great Jehovah. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and he's not angry at just the spokespersons, the Chaldeans. He's not angry at just the magicians and the enchanters and the sorcerers and the witchcraft and the Chaldeans. He's angry at everybody that has one of those labels across his entire kingdom, including you know who. Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And because the king was angry and very furious and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. He said, I've funded these guys for 3 years, and that was just one of the classes. I've been funding these guys, and they can't help me. Get rid of them. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. There's an interesting note. When Paul was on that ship headed towards Rome, there were several, 276 of them, 275 plus Paul, whose lives were spared because of righteous people. Paul was there, Aristarchus was there, Luke was there. We don't know who else was there that was righteous, but a bunch of people had their lives spared because of righteous people. That's where the United States is today. The United States is being spared because of the prayers of God's people. Imagine when the rapture comes, and we're going to get into this stuff as we get into the latter chapters of Daniel. Somebody's going to say, where's the United States in all this? We're going to see the bear, and we're going to see the leopard, and we're going to see the sheep, and we're going to see the goat, but we're not going to see the eagle. Imagine the rapture. God's saved and praying people disappear. People that were on the same plane or the same train or in the same lane of traffic, they're disappearing too, because they're going to be caught up in this big old crash. It's going to be a big catastrophic disaster. The United States is not going to be in any position to deal with foreign policy. If our government is still around, We're going to be worried about our own internal affairs. And so God is protecting this nation, and I pray that he continues to protect this nation. Then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to the messenger, to Arioch. Now, he's an interesting character, too. He was told, go round these guys up and kill them all off. Daniel's going to go to Arioch and say, let's talk about this. So Arioch went out, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon, and Daniel declared to Arioch, the king's captain, why is the decree of the king so urgent? Then Arioch made the matter known to Daniel. Daniel and his three were not in the courtroom at the time of the dream request. The only thing that he knows was the captain of the guard came out with the order to kill. So Daniel, very patient, we see prudent, we see discreet, is trying to understand what is happening. He's in discovery mode. And Daniel went in and requested the king to appoint a time that he might show the interpretation to the king. Very different than the Chaldeans. The Chaldeans, they said, Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar's response to the Chaldeans is, you're just trying to buy time. Daniel goes in with prudence and discretion, and Nebuchadnezzar gives him the time. So we have a verse here from Proverbs. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. The tongue of the wise commends knowledge, but the mouths of fools pour out folly. I can see Daniel in the top half of that verse, and I can see those Chaldeans in the bottom half of that verse. The eyes of the Lord are in every place, keeping watch on the evil and the good. Looking at that verse, and I'm thinking of the accusation that was made because Daniel chose to pray against the king's orders. The Lord's eyes are on the evil, those conspirators that were trying to trip up Daniel, and the Lord's eyes were on the good. A gentle tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. So God reveals Daniel's dream. Daniel went to his house. First, he goes to the king, and he says, King, can we please have some time? King says, sure, no problem. He starts his stopwatch going. Daniel goes home, gets together with his buddies, and he told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven. Notice he didn't tell them to seek the answer. Seek mercy. We're going to see in chapter 9, first of all, in a couple of clicks, we're going to introduce Daniel as not just a man of integrity, not just a man of prophecy, but also a man of prayer. And in chapter 9, prompted with Daniel reading from Jeremiah that the captivity is going to last 70 years. And if my clock is right, Daniel's 84 years old. He reads that and he goes to God in prayer. And he says, we have sinned. He was praying. He was interceding for the nation. He didn't say, my blood brothers. He didn't say the nation of Israel. He said, we have sinned. And here he is saying, first of all, seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed along with the rest of the wise men. Notice the prayer, again, wasn't just for those four. It was for everybody in jeopardy. So a man of integrity, a man of prophecy, a man of prayer. And we'll see it in chapters 2, 6, 9, and 10. Then the mystery was revealed to Daniel in a vision of the night. Daniel I can picture him praying through the night. I've done that. I'm sure you've done that on occasion. Praying through the night. And while he was awake, while he was in prayer, he's given the answer. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. We're building up to that verse 21, the key verse. And Daniel answered and said, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. Every time I see a phrase like that, blessed be the name of God, I think of that one psalm, I think it's 103. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me. Bless his holy name. Bless the Lord, O my soul, and forget not all his benefits. And then he goes on, he talks about he's forgiven me of my iniquities. He's healed me of my disasters. He's satisfied my mouth with the good things. So he says, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, to whom belong wisdom and might. He changes times and seasons. He removes kings and sets up kings. That's the interpretation. Babylon to the Medes, Persians, to the Greeks, to the Romans, to Jesus. He gives wisdom to the wise and knowledge to those who have understanding. Is that fair? He's going to give more wisdom to those that are already wise.
Yes.
That is fair. Okay. James tells us, if any man lack wisdom, let him ask of God, who giveth to all men liberally, freely. And let him ask in faith, nothing wavering. For a double-minded man is unstable in all his ways. God reveals the deep and hidden things. The Bible says that the secret things belong to God, but it's our responsibility to search them out. And there are some things that I'm just never going to understand, but that doesn't mean I don't quit searching. I love Mark Twain. He said, the things in the Bible I understand, I don't understand. He said, they don't bother me. But the things in the Bible that I do understand, those are the things that bother me. He reveals deep and hidden things. He knows what is in the darkness, and the light dwells with him. To you, O God of my fathers, I give thanks and praise, for you have given me wisdom and might, and you have now made known to me what we asked of you, for you have made known to us the king's matter. Here's this guy, SAT 16,000, in the king's court, about to have his head chopped off, and God answers his prayer. We see a man of integrity, and you see God whose will is sovereign. Therefore, Daniel went to Arioch. That was the messenger. That was the captain of the guard. Daniel went to Arioch, whom the king had appointed to destroy the wise men of Babylon. He went and said thus to him, do not destroy the wise men of Babylon. Bring me in before the king, and I will show the king the interpretation. Did Arioch believe him? Yes. How do we know that? Watch what Arioch does. He's going to stick his neck out. Notice that phrase, I have found. If he found the wise men that could give the interpretation, maybe he's in for a little bit of reward also. If he didn't think Daniel had the answer, he could have gone to the king and said, I got this guy who thinks he could answer your question. He didn't do that. Then Arioch brought in Daniel before the king in haste and said thus to him, I have found among the exiles from Judah a man who will make known to the king the interpretation. He stuck his neck out. This comes from 1 Corinthians. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. In 1 Corinthians, the Bible says he hasn't chose many wise, but the wise ones that he did choose were super wise. There was Moses, schooled in everything that Egypt had to offer. There was Daniel, SAT 16,000. There was Solomon, wisest man that ever lived. There was Paul, smarter than and more advanced than any of his contemporaries. There's a handful. And then there's us, right? He didn't choose many wise. The king declared to Daniel, whose name was Baal, protect the king. The king declared to Daniel, whose name was Belteshazzar, are you able to make known to me the dream that I have seen and its interpretation? Because if you're not, off goes your head, right?
And what at this point, Daniel's what, a 17-year-old kid, perhaps?
He's a 17-year-old kid in front of the grand potentate over all the earth. Daniel answered the king and said, No wise men, enchanters, magicians, or astrologers can show to the king the mystery that the king has asked. But there is a God. What did Joseph say to Pharaoh? Not the exact same words as written here, but there is a God who reveals mysteries, and he has made known to King Nebuchadnezzar what will be in the latter days. You see that phrase latter days throughout the Old Testament, and it always points to the same things. It points to Jesus. Your dream and the visions of your head as you lay in bed are these. So you see your dream and visions. He is getting this thing while he's asleep and while he's awake. And that's why I'm thinking he knew all along with that, I'll call it scenario because it's dream and vision. He knew, my opinion is he knew all along what it was. To you, O king, as you lay in bed, came thoughts of what would be after this. What's going to happen to you, O king? Your dad died. Your grandfather died. Your great-grandfather died. What's going to happen to you? What's going to happen to all these riches? What's going to happen to all this power? And he who reveals mysteries made known to you what is to be. Not just what's going to happen to old Neb, but for centuries later. But as for me, this mystery has been revealed to me not because of any wisdom that I have more than all the living, but in order that the interpretation may be known to the king and that you may know the thoughts of your mind. Just like Joseph. Joseph didn't take any of the credit. He gave it all to God. So Daniel interprets the dream. You saw, O king, and behold a great image. He's not going to just explain the dream, but he's going to explain the emotions the king had as the dream is coming to him. You saw, O king, and behold a great image. This image, mighty and of exceeding brightness, stood before you, and its appearance was frightening. The head of this image was of fine gold, its chest and arms of silver, its middle and thighs of bronze, its legs of iron, its feet partly of iron and partly of clay. And as you looked, a stone was cut out by no human hand, and it struck the image on its feet of iron and clay and broke them in pieces. And then the iron, the clay, the bronze, the silver, and the gold all together were broken in pieces and became like the chaff of the summer threshing floors, and the wind carried them away, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. It's no coincidence that the god of Babylon, Marduk, his name meant the great mountain. So Jesus is going to become that great mountain. So there's a collapse of an empire, but that started at the top. Little bit of local flavor. There's a collapse of an empire. It started at the sides, but it was circular more than the vertical that we're talking about right now. I include that one because I think it's pretty cool. That collapse came everywhere. See those explosions from all over the place? That was the King Dome in King County, Seattle. And there's a collapse from the bottom. Now, what do all those collapses have in common?
Dust.
Dust. Dust. We just read where when that thing collapses, it's going to be blown away like the chaff of the wind, so that not a trace of them could be found. But the stone that struck the image became a great mountain and filled the whole earth. We talked about the millennial reign and how some people don't quite see it as a literal thing that's happening. I take it very literally. I take it that when when Jesus comes back and he comes on the Mount of Olives and he goes down to the Kidron Valley and he goes up into Jerusalem, the Bible says in Zechariah that there's going to be an earthquake running east to west, and it's going to separate north from the south. And there's going to be a river flowing out from the threshold of the temple, and it's going to flow into the Mediterranean. It's going to flow into the Dead Sea, and it's going to make the Dead Sea fresh again so that they can fish there. And just like the topology changed after Noah's flood, I believe that Zion is going to raise up. The Bible talks about the mountains will made be flat and the valleys will be filled. John the Baptist said, make straight the way of the Lord. The Bible says that 10 guys are going to hang on to the skirt of a Jew to go see King Jesus on that great mountain. This was the dream. Now we will tell the king its interpretation. You, O king, the King of kings, to whom the God of heaven has given the kingdom, the power, and the might, and the glory. He was given the position. He was given the sustaining power to keep those 127 provinces under control. He was given the power to keep all of his courtier guys from killing him off. And he was given the glory. He was given everything that you could imagine. And into whose hand he has given. Notice twice, he has given. Now here's the problem. See down the bottom where it says you are the head of gold? Nebuchadnezzar let the head of gold get to his head. Nebuchadnezzar was thinking, I defeated the Egyptians. I defeated the Jews. I built this beautiful city. And we're going to see how he has to pay for that in chapter 4. Verse 38, and into whose hand he has given wherever they dwell, the children of men, the beasts of the field, the birds of the heaven, making you rule over them all. You are the head of gold. Another kingdom inferior to you. We're going to see a chart that we come across here later on that's going to show the gold, the silver, the brass, the iron, the clay, the forms of government that go from absolute power down to anarchy. The specific weight, to talk a little chemistry, the specific weight of each of those things, gold, silver, brass, iron, they get lighter, they don't get heavier. The thing is top heavy. So another kingdom inferior to you shall arise after you, and yet a third kingdom of bronze shall rule over all the earth. And there shall be a fourth kingdom, strong as iron. Notice, he's mentioned gold here. He's mentioned bronze or brass. King James would say brass. And he's mentioned iron. He has skipped one in terms of the metals. Which one did he skip? He skipped the silver. Now, the reason that's important is this. In the Bible, gold always stands for the glory of God. Silver always stands for redemption. Brass always stands for judgment, bronze. And iron always stands for power and inflexibility. Jesus is going to rule with a rod of iron, power and inflexibility. But he skipped the silver. We're going to see something here. Note that silver is not mentioned. Now watch. Revelation. Then I turned to see the voice that was speaking to me, and on turning I saw 7 golden lampstands, and in the midst of the lampstands one like a son of God, clothed with a long robe, with a golden sash around his chest. There's the gold. The hair of his head was white like wool, and white as snow, and his eyes were like a flame of fire. His feet were like burnished bronze. Skipped right over the silver. Refined in a furnace, and his voice was like the roar of many waters. No silver mentioned, and he'll rule with a rod of iron. The purpose of the tribulation period. There will be people saved. The Bible says thousands upon thousands of every tongue and every nation. But the purpose of the tribulation period, which is the end of all this prophecy, is that God who is all powerful, the glory of God, is going to judge the nation of Israel. Jeremiah refers to it as the time of Jacob's troubles. And here's a picture of that as well. And as you saw the feet and toes, partly of potter's clay and partly of iron, it shall be a divided kingdom, but some of the firmness of iron shall be in it, just as you saw iron mixed with the soft clay. And as the toes of the feet were partly iron and partly clay, so the kingdom shall be partly strong and partly brittle. And as you saw the iron mixed with soft clay, so they will mix with one another in marriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron does not mix with clay. There's a lot of time spent here on this mixture of iron and clay. And one of my first jobs was with Lucan Steel, and I'd go down to that furnace, and they would pull the slag off the top of that heat, because the slag, that impurity, would make the steel weak. And that's what they're talking about here, a weakness. And we're going to see that this is going to go from Babylon, single potentate, the head, down to the Medes and the Persians, two shoulders, the Medes and the Persians, down to the Greeks. And in the latter chapter, we're going to see a goat that had 4 horns, and just as, actually 5 horns, and just as Alexander the Great died when he was 33, his nation, his empire, was divided across the 4 generals, and it's going to go down to Rome. And that image has 2 legs, and you're going to see the Eastern Empire, Constantinople, now Istanbul, and you're going to see Rome. And ultimately it goes down into the toes. And I'm getting ahead of myself with that chart that I promised you. So here's Daniel explaining to Nebuchadnezzar about that dream. And here is the history fulfillment. We're going to see all these names. Right now, it's just the dream. We're going to see the names in latter chapters. And ultimately, we're going to see these beasts. And each of these beasts come back and they tie once again to the Medes and the Persians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You don't see any lions there. But what's interesting is some aspect of every one of those beasts will find itself in the beast of Revelation chapter 13. What we're going to see here is this is a chronological view of world history. But the beast in Revelation 13 is all the issues and powers and characteristics of all those different kinds of kingdoms, all baked into one. So here's that chart I kept mentioning. The Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks and the Romans. The value kept getting less and less and less. It starts with gold and ends up with clay. The weight, the density, heavy-duty gold, on down. The characteristic, Nebuchadnezzar was absolute monarchy. What he said, he said. He said to the Chaldeans, he said, it is firm. It was done. When you get to the Medes and the Persians, the kings were governed by laws. And that's why Daniel had to go into the lion's den. That's why when Haman's decree went out to kill the Jews in Esther's time, they couldn't change that law because the king was bound. Then we come down into the Greeks. And in the Greeks, they were controlled by the military. They could have had a coup anytime that they wanted. And ultimately, you come down to the Romans, where the emperor was elected by the people, but then the emperor did what he wanted to do. Ultimately, you come down to democracy, socialism, anarchy. A mention about the metals. Nebuchadnezzar was gold. He was absolute. When we talk about silver, the first currency was the Medes Persians, and their coins were made out of silver. And I said silver stood for salvation or redemption. It was the Medes and the Persians that redeemed Jerusalem, redeemed the Jews back to Jerusalem. It was Cyrus that made that decree. The Greeks were in brass or bronze. And you see here the Battle of Plataea. What happened at that battle? That was the last battle where the Greeks totally wiped out the Persians. What happened was the Greeks took their shields of brass and they spent the whole day before polishing them. And they decided they're going to set up the battle with the Greeks facing east. And when the Persians came, the Greeks took those brass shields and they angled them in such a way that the reflection went right into the eyes of the Persians, blinded them, and that's how they won the battle. And then you come down to the Romans. They ruled with an iron fist. And I'm going to tell you, we are today in toe time. That's an easy way to remember where we are. We're in toe time today. So I have this handout for you. I'll take one and pass them around. If you wanted the soft copy, you just have to Google and that title, and then click on images, and you'll find it. Anyone ever hear of Clarence Larkin before? Clarence Larkin? Oh, about 100 years ago, he was the pastor of the Kennett Square Baptist Church. His dad wanted him to be an architect, and he was obviously good at mechanical drawing, but he decided to go the theological route instead. So he ended up being a pastor, and then he wanted to be an author, and he wanted to do things like this. So he ended up in a portion of Philadelphia, Fox Chase, and he did these things. So if you want to see all those really cool charts about Revelation and Daniel, just Google Clarence Larkin charts, and you will see lots of cool stuff. I happen to have a book of all those charts, but I would prefer getting it from Google. They're easier to read and easier to project. But what we're going to see on this sheet of paper, you can look at the paper, you can follow my mouse here. You see here the gold, the silver, the brass, the iron, and the clay. And you see Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonians, the Medes and the Persians, the Greeks, and the Romans. We'll go all the way up to the top. This chart explains the rest of the book of Daniel. Daniel talks about his 70 weeks. There were 69 weeks, or 69 times 7 years, between the decree to rebuild the temple till the time Jesus died on the cross. Rebuild the city. Sorry. Daniel didn't get to see the church age. That was just a vacuum. And then his last week is over here, where it's split in half. The Great Tribulation. There you have the 4 horsemen and the abomination of desolation and the last 3.5 years. The stone that we read in Daniel chapter 2 is Jesus coming back in Revelation chapter 19. He comes back, and I said he sets foot on the Mount of Olives, and he returns into Jerusalem, and he sets up his millennial reign, his kingdom reign. We're going to come down over into chapters 7, and you see these other beasts, and we'll expand on all those different beasts. And I said to you, they all consolidate in the 13th chapter of Revelation. And that will be the heart of what we're going to study. Before we get there, there are some things that Daniel uncovers. Chapter 3, and here's where Ray's going to pick up. Chapter 3 talks about the fiery furnace. And the question that might be haunting you is, where was Daniel through all this? Chapter 4, I mentioned to you that Nebuchadnezzar, he saw the head of gold, but the head of gold went to his head. And he's going to be put out to pasture literally for 7 years. Nebuchadnezzar dies. I'm convinced he died a saved man. Nebuchadnezzar dies. His son-in-law becomes the king. The son-in-law is out of town. Belshazzar decides to have a big old party. And worse yet, he chooses to use all the cups and the flatware and the plates that were consecrated to God in the temple. and he sees the handwriting on the wall. And that night, the Medes and the Persians entered into the city, and Babylon fell.